I used to think I could read Emily like a book. After 8 years of marriage, you assume you know everything about a person, their habits, their quirks, what makes them tick. I thought I knew Emily inside and out, but I was wrong. It started with the little things. She used to be open, carefree, easy to talk to. Over time, though, something changed. She grew distant, just enough to make me wonder, not enough to confront her. There was a shift in the way she looked at me, a subtle hesitation in her words, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. The late nights at work became more frequent. She'd smile and say she had an urgent project to finish, but I'd catch glimpses of her glancing at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. And then there were the new clothes, expensive ones I hadn't seen her wear before, not to our dinners, not for any occasion I could remember. They didn't seem to be for me. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself we were just going through a rough patch. After all, careers had a way of pulling people apart. We were both working harder than ever, trying to build something for our future. But the more I tried to explain it away, the harder it became to ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Deep down, I knew. Then one night, everything unraveled. It was past midnight. Emily had gone downstairs saying she couldn't sleep and was going to make some tea, but she didn't come back to bed. I tried to shake off the unease, but I couldn't. Something had kept her in the kitchen for too long. I heard her voice, low, hushed. It wasn't like the soft tones she used when she spoke to me. It was sharper, more secretive. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more, but the words were too quiet. She was talking to someone, and whoever it was, she didn't want me to hear the conversation. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and tiptoed down the stairs. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but she didn't notice. Her voice was too absorbed, too caught up in whatever she was planning. "No, tomorrow," I heard her say, her tone edged with impatience. "Same place, be ready." I froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack my ribs. Tomorrow, same place, be ready. What was she talking about? Who was she meeting? I crept closer, peeking around the corner. Emily stood by the kitchen window, her back to me, her phone pressed to her ear. Her stance was tense, her words clipped. She wasn't herself. This wasn't the Emily I knew. My chest tightened as a dozen possibilities raced through my mind. Was she having an affair? Was she planning something else, something worse? I backed away, retreating into the shadows, my mind spinning. The look in her eyes, the tone of her voice, it was all wrong. Emily was hiding something, and whatever it wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind running wild with questions and doubts. Was she seeing someone else? Was she planning to leave me? Or was there something deeper, something darker happening that I couldn't even begin to understand? By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the curtains, I had already made up my mind. I needed to know the truth, but I couldn't confront her outright. Not yet. If I asked her directly, she'd deny everything, twist the situation until I was left doubting myself. No, I had to be smarter. I had to catch her in the act. That morning, I left the house earlier than usual, pretending to head to work. But instead of going to the office, I parked 2 blocks away, far enough that she wouldn't notice me, but close enough to keep an eye on her. I waited. At 8:30 sharp, Emily left the house, just as she did every day. But today was different. She wasn't dressed for the office. No professional clothes, no makeup. She looked casual, almost relaxed, like she was meeting someone outside of work. The thought made my stomach turn. I followed her, keeping a safe distance, my heart racing with every turn she made. She didn't take her usual route into the city. Instead, she drove toward the industrial district, a part of town filled with old warehouses and factories that had long since been abandoned. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would go for a business meeting. It was the kind of place where people went to hide things. My hands were sweating on the wheel as I trailed behind her, trying to make sense of what was happening. Emily pulled off the main road and onto a narrow street lined with rusted chain-link fences and broken windows. I parked a block away, far enough not to be noticed, but close enough to watch her every move. She slowed to a stop in front of a large decaying warehouse, its exterior covered in graffiti and layers of grime from years of neglect. I watched as she got out of the car, her movements quick, purposeful. She glanced around, as if checking to see if she was being followed, but she didn't see me. I crouched lower in my seat, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't an affair. This was something else, something far worse. Emily walked toward the entrance of the warehouse, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. I watched, frozen, as a man emerged from the shadows. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. His face was hard, his expression unreadable, and when their eyes met, he gave her a quick nod, like this was routine, like they had done this before. She handed him something. Small, metallic. It was too far away for me to see exactly what it was, but the way she handed it to him told me it wasn't casual. This wasn't the first time they'd met, and whatever she had given him, it was important. They exchanged a few words. Their voices too low for me to hear from my hiding spot, but I didn't need to hear them to know what was happening. The way Emily's body tensed, the way the man's gaze lingered on her, assessing and sharp, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just an affair. This was something dangerous, and Emily was right in the middle of it. I stayed hidden in my car for what felt like hours after Emily left the warehouse. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Who was the man? What had she handed him? And why had she kept all of this from me? The questions churned in my head, each one more unsettling than the last. By the time I followed her back home, I had already decided on my next move. I couldn't confront her yet, not until I knew more, not until I had all the pieces. I had to be patient, even though every instinct I had screamed at me to demand answers. But I knew Emily. She wouldn't crack easily. If this was something bigger than an affair, one wrong move could send everything spiraling out of control. I couldn't afford to lose my chance at the truth. That evening, we sat across from each other at the dinner table, just like we had 100 times before. But this time, there was a new tension between us, an invisible barrier that hadn't been there before. Emily smiled at me, the same smile she always gave me when she knew she was in control. And I smiled back, pretending I hadn't seen what I saw, pretending that everything was fine. But the questions burned inside me, and I knew I wouldn't rest until I had answers. The next morning, I left the house at the usual time, but instead of heading to work, I returned to the warehouse. I needed to see for myself what was happening there, to find something that could explain Emily's involvement. I parked a block away again, careful to stay out of sight, and made my way toward the entrance. The warehouse loomed over me, its broken windows and rusted doors giving it an eerie, abandoned feel. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty space. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the remnants of old machinery and forgotten equipment scattered across the floor. I retraced Emily's steps in my mind, remembering where she had stood when she met the man. I searched the area, looking for anything they might have left behind, anything that could give me a clue as to what was going on. And then, I saw it, a small metal box, half hidden behind a stack of crates. My heart raced as I crouched down, pulling the box out into the light. It wasn't locked, and when I opened it, I found a stack of documents inside. Financial statements, emails, contracts, everything was there. And it all led back to me. My name was on the papers, tied to every shady deal, every under-the-table payout I had tried to forget. But Emily had been collecting this evidence, gathering proof of my involvement for months. And she wasn't just going to use it to leave me, she was going to destroy me. I drove home with the weight of the documents heavy in my mind. Emily had been planning this for a long time, longer than I had ever suspected. She wasn't just gathering evidence, she was building a case, piece by piece, stacking everything against me. Every shady deal, every misstep I had made at the firm, all laid bare. And now, with the keycard and the meeting at the warehouse, I knew there was more to this than just a betrayal. She was setting me up to take the fall. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hands were shaking. How had I not seen it? How had I let her manipulate me so completely? The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, she had been playing me from the start. The documents were just the tip of the iceberg. There had to be more, something deeper. I slammed the car door shut and walked into the house, my thoughts spinning with every step. Emily was in the kitchen, just like every other evening. The scent of garlic and herbs filled the air, but it felt wrong now. How many nights had I sat at this very table, eating the meals she cooked, never realizing what she was really doing? "Hey," she said, turning around with a smile. "You're home early again. Rough day?" I couldn't look at her the same way. I couldn't bear to say that smile, that practiced expression of concern. She had worn that mask for months, maybe even years, all while planning to ruin me. But I had to keep my composure. I couldn't let her know what I had found. Not yet. "Yeah," I muttered, forcing a smile. "Just needed a break from everything." Emily nodded, going back to stirring the pot on the stove. She hummed quietly, completely unaware that her carefully constructed web was beginning to unravel. But I had to be careful. One wrong move, and she would know I was onto her. That night, I couldn't sleep. The documents, the keycard, the man from the warehouse, everything played in my mind over and over. I could feel the walls closing in around me, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on my chest like a vice. But I had the keycard. I had the evidence. And now I had a plan. I would confront her, but not until I had all the pieces. The next morning, I followed Emily again. She left the house at the same time, her routine as precise as ever. But this time, I wasn't just watching, I was looking for answers. She drove back to the industrial district, her path predictable, like clockwork. But instead of going inside the warehouse, she parked around the corner and walked toward a nearby building. It was smaller, less conspicuous, tucked between two abandoned factories. I watched as she used the keycard to enter the building, slipping inside without hesitation. My pulse quickened. Whatever was inside that building, it was the key to everything. Once she was gone, I parked my car and approached the building. It was old, like everything else in the district, with chipped paint and rust covering the doors. I tried the handle. It was locked, but the keycard slot was right beside it. My heart pounded as I slid the keycard into the slot, half expecting it not to work. But the light turned green. I pushed the door open, stepping inside. The interior was as abandoned as the rest of the district, with dust coating every surface and the faint smell of mildew in the air. I moved cautiously, my eyes scanning the space for anything that could explain what Emily had been doing. In the corner, half hidden behind stacks of old equipment, was another metal box. My hands trembled as I opened it, praying that it would give me the answers I needed. Inside were more documents, not just papers implicating me, but documents linking Emily to everything. Bank transfers, offshore accounts, email printouts, all tied to her. She wasn't just framing me, she was laundering money through the firm. She had been involved in the same dirty dealings I had, but she had found a way to make it all look like my fault. At the bottom of the box was a letter, addressed to Carter. My heart raced as I unfolded it. Emily's handwriting unmistakable. Carter, everything is in place. Mark is falling into the trap. Just as we planned, I'll keep feeding him bits of information to make sure he thinks he's in control. But by the time he realizes what's really happening, it'll be too late. I crumpled the letter in my hand, rage boiling inside me. She had been manipulating me from the start, leading me down this path, making sure I'd be the one to take the fall. And Carter, the man from the warehouse, he wasn't just some accomplice. He was her partner in all of this. I needed to confront her, but I needed to be smart about it. If I wasn't careful, she would turn this around on me. I couldn't let her win. That evening, I walked into the house with a new sense of purpose. The letter was tucked into my jacket pocket, the keycard still in my hand. Emily was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone, her face calm and serene, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I stood in the doorway, watching her, my fists clenched at my sides. My mind raced with everything I had learned. She had lied to me, manipulated me, and now she was going to destroy me unless I stopped her. But I couldn't let my anger show. Not yet. Emily, I said, my voice steady but cold. We need to talk. She glanced up from her phone, her expression unreadable. What is it? She asked, her tone casual, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. I know what you've been doing, I said, stepping closer, my eyes locked onto hers. I followed you today, to the warehouse. I saw you meet with Carter. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes, surprise maybe or fear, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She set her phone down and stood up, crossing her arms in front of her chest. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice calm, but there was an edge to it, a tension she was trying to hide. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled letter, holding it up for her to see. You've been lying to me, you and Carter. You've been setting me up, haven't you? Emily's face hardened, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the letter, but instead of denying it, she smiled, a slow, cold smile that sent a chill down my spine. Mark, she said softly, shaking her head. You always were so predictable. I knew you'd follow me eventually, but it doesn't matter. I took another step closer, my fists clenched tighter. What are you talking about? Her smile faded, replaced by the cold, calculating expression I had come to hate. It's already done. Everything is in place. You're going down for this, Mark, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. My heart raced as I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. You think you can just frame me and walk away? You think I'm going to let you get away with this? Emily's eyes gleamed with something dark, something triumphant. You don't have a choice. I've been gathering evidence for months. Every deal, every transaction, every dirty secret. You've left a trail of breadcrumbs, and all I had to do was follow it. She took a step closer, her voice lowering to a whisper. You're finished. Emily's words cut through me like a blade. The woman I had loved, trusted, and built a life with was standing before me, revealing her true nature. A cold, calculating stranger. She had everything planned, every step calculated, and I had walked right into her trap. but I couldn't let her have the last word. "You're not going to win this," I said, my voice low, barely containing the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I found your documents. Everything you've been hiding. You've been laundering money through the firm, and I have the proof." For the first time, Emily faltered. Her smile didn't disappear, but it wavered slightly, her eyes flickering with something that might have been fear, or maybe annoyance. "Proof?" she asked, her voice still controlled. "What proof?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded stack of papers I had found in the hidden box at the warehouse. The contracts, the signatures, the money transfers, all tied to her and her dealings with Carter. "These," I said, holding them up for her to see. "You're not as clever as you think. You made mistakes and now I have the upper hand." Emily's eyes darkened. She didn't speak for a long moment, and the silence between us thickened with tension. Finally, she shook her head, that cold smile returning to her lips. "You still don't get it, do you? Even with those papers, no one's going to believe you. You've been involved in these shady deals for years. You're the one who's been signing off on everything. You're the one with your name all over the records." I stepped closer, anger flaring in my chest. "But you're involved too. You've been pulling the strings, and now that I know the truth, I can make sure you go down with me." Emily's eyes narrowed, and for the first time I saw a crack in her composure. "You're bluffing," she said, her voice harder now. "You don't have enough to stop me." Before I could respond, the front door slammed open, and Carter stormed into the house. The tension in the room spiked instantly, my heart leaping into my throat as I turned to face him. He was even bigger up close than I had remembered, broad-shouldered, with a face carved from stone, his eyes cold and filled with menace. He looked at me, then at Emily, quickly taking in the situation. "What's going on?" he growled, his voice a low rumble. Emily didn't even flinch. "Mark's found the documents," she said calmly, her voice steady. "He knows everything." Carter's gaze flicked back to me, his expression hardening. His jaw tightened, and I could see the barely contained fury behind his eyes. "I told you to keep quiet," he snapped at Emily before turning his full attention back to me. "You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong," Carter said, taking a step closer, his voice dripping with threat. "You should have stayed out of it." My pulse pounded in my ears. I glanced at Emily, who remained perfectly still, watching the two of us with a detached, almost clinical interest. She had been orchestrating this the entire time, and now she was content to let Carter deal with me. I took a step back, my hands trembling as the reality of the situation set in. Carter wasn't just here to intimidate me. He was here to make sure I didn't interfere, and Emily had set the stage for all of it. Carter moved toward me, his eyes locked on mine, and I could see the danger in every step. He was going to do more than just scare me. He was going to make sure I couldn't stop them. I glanced at the kitchen counter, where a sharp kitchen knife lay, just within reach. My pulse quickened, and before I knew what I was doing, I lunged for it. Carter reacted immediately, his hand grabbing for my wrist, but I was faster. My fingers closed around the knife handle, and in one swift motion, I swung it toward him, aiming for his side. The blade cut through the air, and Carter let out a grunt of pain as the knife sliced into his flesh, just beneath his ribs. He staggered back, his hand flying to his side, blood seeping through his fingers. His eyes flared with fury and disbelief as he looked down at the wound, then back at me. "You bastard," he growled, his voice thick with rage. Emily gasped, a sharp strangled sound, but she didn't move from her spot by the doorway. For the first time since all of this began, I saw genuine fear in her eyes as she watched her brother stumble back, his strength fading with every drop of blood that hit the floor. Carter's gaze flicked to Emily, then back to me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice hoarse. And then, with a final painful grunt, he turned and staggered toward the door, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. He pulled the door open and disappeared into the night, the sound of the door slamming shut behind him echoing through the house. For a long moment, everything was silent. I stood there, panting, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The knife slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, its blade stained with Carter's blood. I stared at it, unable to process what I had just done. I had stabbed him. I had crossed a line I never thought I would. The kitchen was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft drip of blood hitting the floor. The reality of what had just happened settled over me like a weight, pressing down on my chest. My hands were trembling, my mind spinning with the consequences of what I had just done. Emily still hadn't moved. She stood frozen by the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. But there was something else in her expression now, something darker. Her fear had quickly faded, replaced by the cold calculating look she had worn before. She was already thinking ahead, already planning her next move. "You've really done it now," she said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was cold, almost amused. "Carter's going to the police. He'll tell them everything. And when they come here, what do you think they'll see? You standing in a kitchen covered in blood." I shook my head, still struggling to catch my breath. "This wasn't my fault," I said, my voice rough and strained. "He attacked me. I didn't have a choice." Emily stepped forward, her eyes locked onto mine, her expression hardening. "It doesn't matter. The evidence is already stacked against you, and now you've given them something else. They'll see the blood, the knife, and Carter's testimony. You'll take the fall for everything." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer, the weight of them knocking the wind out of me. She was right. I was trapped. The knife, the blood, everything pointed to me. And if Carter survived long enough to tell his side of the story, I would be finished. Emily smiled again, that fat and triumphant smile that made my blood run cold. "You were always too predictable, Mark. I knew you'd crack eventually. All I had to do was push you far enough, and you'd do exactly what I needed you to do." I backed away from her, my mind racing, trying to find a way out, but every exit was blocked. Every path led to the same conclusion. I was trapped, and Emily had planned it all from the start. "You're insane," I whispered, my voice trembling with fear and rage. "You set all of this up. You wanted this to happen." Emily shrugged, her smile widening. "I did what I had to do. You were a liability, Mark. I had to protect myself. And now, well, now it's just a matter of time before the police show up. I'd suggest you start thinking about what you're going to tell them." The house was quiet again, but the silence was suffocating. Carter was gone, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Emily stood across from me, her eyes locked on mine, waiting for me to make a move. But I couldn't think. My mind was a blur of panic and disbelief. I had stabbed him, I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. "You're not going to get away with this," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll find a way to stop you. I'll find a way to make this right." Emily shook her head slowly, her expression almost pitying. "There's no fixing this, Mark. It's too late for that. You've already lost." I stood frozen, the kitchen around me no longer feeling like the home I'd lived in for years. It was a battlefield now, a place where blood had been spilled, trust shattered. The scent of garlic and herbs that once comforted me now felt like poison, heavy in the air, choking me with every breath. Emily stood just a few feet away, but she felt miles apart, an untouchable force. Her eyes gleamed with a cold satisfaction, as if everything was falling perfectly into place, exactly as she had planned. "You've lost," she repeated, her voice sharp, slicing through the suffocating silence. My mind whirled, replaying her words. Carter's blood, the knife on the floor. The walls of the room seemed to close in on me, and I could hardly breathe, my chest tightening as if a weight were pressing down on it. Everything was unraveling faster than I could comprehend. "Why?" I managed to choke out, my voice hoarse. "Why did you do this, Emily? We had a life together. Why destroy everything like this?" She tilted her head slightly, her expression softening for just a moment, but it wasn't out of remorse. It was pity, pity for my ignorance. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, stepping closer, her voice dripping with disdain. "This was never about us. This was about survival. I saw where things were headed with your business. The firm was getting too hot, and you were too deep in the muck to see the writing on the wall. So I did what I had to do." I shook my head, disbelief flooding my system. "You could have told me. We could have figured it out together." Her laugh cut me off, cold and cruel. "Together? Mark, don't you see? I couldn't trust you to keep things under control. You were reckless, making deals that put everything we built at risk. I had to protect myself. And if that meant framing you, well, better you than me." The weight of her words sank in slowly. This wasn't just about betrayal or revenge. This was about survival, about her calculating every move with ruthless precision. I had been nothing more than a pawn in her game, and she had played me perfectly. "So you destroy me to save yourself?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and despair. "You'd throw everything away? For what?" Emily's eyes flashed with something darker. "For freedom, Mark. Freedom from you, from the firm, from all the mess you created." The quiet was shattered by the ringing of my phone, vibrating loudly in my pocket. My heart lurched as I fumbled to pull it out, my fingers slick with sweat. The screen flashed with an unknown number. Instinct told me not to answer, but something deeper, the fear that it was already too late, forced my hand. I brought the phone to my ear, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hello?" A deep, familiar voice rasped through the line. "It's not over," Carter growled, his voice thick with pain, but laced with a menace that made my blood run cold. My heart stopped. I glanced at Emily, who was watching me with an unsettling calm. She knew. She had planned for this too. "Carter, you're dead," Carter hissed, cutting me off. "I'll make sure of it. The police will be on their way soon. You won't have time to explain anything before they lock you up." The line went dead, and I stood there, phone clutched in my shaking hand. As the weight of his words settled over me like a shroud, the police were coming. Carter was going to make sure I went down for this, make sure I was blamed for everything. Emily's plan was falling into place, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. "You should go," Emily said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, as if she were giving me simple, practical advice. "There's nothing left for you here. When the police come, they'll find all the evidence. They'll find the blood, the knife, and Carter's story will do the rest." I stared at her, disbelief still coursing through my veins. "You're just going to let me take the fall, after everything?" She shrugged, the cold detachment returning to her features. "It's the only way out for me, Mark. You were always too careless. This was bound to happen eventually. I just made sure I came out clean." My mind raced with possibilities, but each one seemed to head a dead end. There was no escape from this, no way to explain the blood on the floor, the knife, or the documents that linked me to everything. Emily had me trapped, and Carter was the final nail in the coffin. But something inside me snapped. I couldn't let it end like this. I spun on my heel and stormed toward the door, my mind racing, adrenaline pounding through my veins. I had to get out, before the police arrived, before Carter sealed my fate completely. But just as I reached for the door handle, Emily's voice stopped me cold. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice deceptively calm, almost mocking. "You have nowhere to run, Mark. The moment you leave this house, it's over. They'll catch up to you and everything will fall into place. You can't escape what's coming." I turned to face her, the anger boiling over inside me. "I won't let you get away with this," I growled, my voice trembling with fury. "You think you've won, but I'll find a way. I'll find a way to make sure you go down with me." Emily smiled, the same cruel, calculating smile that had haunted me for days. "You're already finished," she said softly. "There's no way out for you, Mark. The only thing left for you to do is run. But even then, it won't be long before they find you." I stared at her, my fists clenched, the urge to lash out almost unbearable. But I knew she was right. If I ran, it would only delay the inevitable. There was no escape from what she had set in motion. She had outmaneuvered me at every turn, and now I was trapped, a rat in a cage with no way out. But I couldn't just walk away. Not yet. My eyes darted to the knife still lying on the floor, stained with Carter's blood. I could feel the weight of it pulling at me, the temptation of its hard steel calling to the darkest part of me. One swift motion, one final act, and it could all be over. I could end this, end her, but I wasn't a killer, not yet. I turned away from the knife, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fought to control the storm of emotions raging inside me. Emily watched me, her eyes never leaving mine, her smile never faltering. She knew she had won. "I suggest you leave now," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "before it gets worse." For a long moment I just stood there, staring at her, my mind a whirlwind of rage, fear, and helplessness. But then, with a final bitter glance at the woman who had once been my wife, I turned and walked out the door. The night air hit me like a slap in the face as I stepped outside. The cold biting at my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind was numb, my thoughts tangled in a web of confusion and disbelief. The world around me felt distant, almost unreal, as if I were watching it all from behind a glass wall. The street was quiet, the shadows long and dark under the flickering streetlights. But I knew it wouldn't be quiet for long. I had minutes, maybe less, before Carter's call set everything in motion. The police would come, and they'd find the blood, the knife, the documents. They'd find everything that pointed to me. And by then, it would be too late. I climbed into my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, jamming them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, but the sound was muffled, distant, drowned out by the pounding in my ears. My heart was racing, my chest tight with panic as I pulled out of the driveway and into the street. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I was going to do. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from here as possible. The city blurred past me as I drove aimlessly, the lights flashing by in streaks of neon and shadow. My thoughts were a tangled mess, spiraling out of control as I tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Emily's betrayal, Carter's threat, the blood on the floor. It all swirled together in a sickening haze of fear and desperation. But one thought stood out above the rest. burning like a brand in the back of my mind. It's not over. The message from Carter still echoed in my ears, a chilling reminder that this nightmare wasn't finished. Emily had played her hand, but Carter was still out there, still bleeding, still waiting for his chance to strike back. And when he did, I knew it wouldn't end well for me. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep letting them control me. I had to take back control. I had to stop them, once and for all. But how? I stared at the phone in my lap, the screen still glowing with Carter's last message. It's not over. No, it wasn't. But this time, I wouldn't be caught off guard. The drive back home felt like the longest in my life. My mind raced with the weight of everything that had happened. The blood on my hands, the way Emily had twisted everything to frame me, and Carter's looming presence, always in the background. Emily thought she had won, but she didn't realize the desperation she had created in me. I wasn't going to let her walk away from this. By the time I reached the driveway, the house stood in cold silence, dark and foreboding. I could see the glow of the kitchen light from outside, the only sign of life inside. My pulse quickened as I stepped out of the car, each footstep heavier than the last. I opened the front door slowly, stepping into the cold, quiet house. The air inside felt suffocating, thick with the weight of what had just happened. Carter's blood was still fresh in my mind, his cold, calculating gaze as he left, promising this wasn't over. And then there was Emily, who had orchestrated this whole nightmare with chilling precision. She was waiting for me in the kitchen. Emily stood by the counter, her phone on the table, her eyes calmly watching me as I stepped inside. There was no surprise on her face, no fear, no remorse, just that same icy, calculating look she had worn for months. The woman I had loved was gone, replaced by this stranger standing before me. "You came back," she said, her voice smooth, almost bored. I didn't respond. I stood frozen in the doorway, my fists clenched at my sides. My eyes darted to the knife still on the floor, its blade glinting under the kitchen lights, stained with Carter's blood, the same blood that could soon seal my fate. "I told you before," Emily continued, stepping forward slightly. "This is over. There's nothing left for you here. The police will be here soon, and when they do, you'll be the one they take. Carter will make sure of it." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't let her see the fear clawing its way up my throat. She had been planning this for so long. I couldn't give her the satisfaction of thinking she had broken me completely. "Why?" I finally managed to ask, my voice raw, strained. "Why go this far? Why destroy everything we built?" Emily's lips curled into a small, mocking smile. "You never understood, did you, Mark? This was never about us. You were always going to go down for what you did. I just made sure I wasn't dragged down with you." I shook my head, disbelief flooding through me. "I would have protected you, Emily. I would have found a way." Her laughter cut me off, cold and sharp. "Protected me? You couldn't even protect yourself. You think I didn't know what you were doing at the firm? You were reckless, arrogant. You made yourself a target, and when everything started to unravel, I did what I had to do." "By framing me," I snapped, my voice rising. "By stabbing me in the back and making sure I took the fall." Emily's eyes narrowed, her smile fading slightly. "You made it easy. You were always too trusting, too blind to see what was happening around you. I gave you every opportunity to walk away, Mark. You didn't take it." I took a step forward, the weight of her words crashing down on me. The knife still lay between us, a silent reminder of the violence that had already erupted between us and Carter. My mind raced with the possibilities, but all of them led back to the same conclusion. Emily had won. There was no undoing the damage she had caused, no escaping the trap she had set for me, but I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I stepped closer, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's not over, Emily," I said, my voice trembling with barely contained fury. "You think you can just frame me and walk away, but you've made one mistake." She raised an eyebrow, her expression cool and collected. "Oh, and what's that?" I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I spoke. "You underestimated me." For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but it was quickly masked by the cold calculation she had perfected over months of deception. "Underestimated you," she repeated, her voice laced with amusement. "What are you going to do, Mark? Call the police and tell them you stabbed Carter in self-defense? Do you really think they'll believe you?" She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto mine. "You're finished. You'll go to prison, and I'll walk away clean. That's how this ends." I glanced down at the knife on the floor, the blood now dried on its blade. My mind raced, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I wasn't a killer, not yet, but the rage boiling inside me made it hard to think clearly. made it hard to breathe. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can fix this. We can find a way out together." Emily shook her head slowly, her eyes cold. "There's no fixing this, Mark. You've already lost." Suddenly, a noise from the hallway caught my attention. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned to see Carter stagger into the room, his hand still clutching his side, blood dripping from the wound I had inflicted earlier. His face was pale, his breath labored, but his eyes were filled with fury. "You thought you could finish me," Carter growled, his voice thick with pain. "You're going to pay for this, Mark." Emily's eyes flicked between me and Carter, a satisfied smirk crossing her lips. "It's over, Mark. Carter's here, and when the police arrive, they'll have all the evidence they need. You'll go down for this." Carter took a step toward me, his face twisted with rage. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears, the room spinning around me. This was it. This was the moment everything would fall apart. But I couldn't let it end like this. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I lunged for the knife. My hand closed around the handle, and in one swift motion, I swung it toward Carter. The blade connected with a sickening thud, and Carter let out a strangled gasp. His eyes wide with shock as he stumbled backward, clutching his chest. Emily screamed, her voice shrill and piercing, but I barely heard her. All I could see was Carter, crumpling to the floor, blood pooling around him as his body went limp. The knife fell from my hand, clattering to the floor, and I stood there, panting, my chest heaving with the weight of what I had just done. The room was spinning, the walls closing in on me, but all I could focus on was the blood. So much blood. Emily was frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock and fear. For the first time, I looked vulnerable, afraid. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You killed him." I shook my head, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't have a choice. He was going to kill me. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't enough. Carter was dead, and I had killed him. There was no going back from this. Emily took a step forward, her voice low and dangerous. "The police will be here soon, Mark. And when they see what you've done, you'll go down for everything." I stared at her, my hands still shaking, my mind reeling with the enormity of what had just happened. She was right. There was no escape now. The police would come, and they would see the blood, the body, and the knife. And I would be the one who took the fall. But as I looked at Emily, I saw something else in her eyes. Fear, real fear. She had lost control of the situation, and she knew it. For the first time, she wasn't the one pulling the strings. I took a step toward her, my voice low and steady. "You're right, Emily. The police will come. And when they do, they'll see what you've done too." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw real panic on her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I turned and walked out of the house, leaving her standing there, surrounded by the wreckage of everything she had destroyed. The cold night air hit me like a shock, but I didn't stop. I kept walking, my mind numb, my body on autopilot. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was finally in control.